Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see you here. Those of you here in person, thanks for those watching via the live stream. We're glad you're with us as well. It's another week in our series, Thinking Critically, Living Biblically, Attending to Scripture in a Complex Modern World. And our topic today, Welcoming the Stranger. Again, we're just going to solve huge problems in 60 minutes. And move on. But again, the purpose of this series is largely to generate questions and to ask, what are the ways in which the Bible might motivate us or sometimes hold us back from how we live in the world, and what does it mean to live biblically, and how do we interpret the Bible when it comes to some really significant issues that are in our lives. So glad you're here and glad to take on another really important topic this Sunday. First, a couple of announcements. Again, we're trying to move toward permanent or semi-permanent name tags, reusable name tags. In the back table, there are lanyards. You can fill one of those out if you're more of a single-use person or don't really want to get up. We've also got some of those on the table. But thanks for wearing your name tags, not just here, good to know people at your tables, but just generally at Westminster as we're starting a new program year. It's a large church. It's a way to kind of shrink it and to help us build connections. So that's great. If you're not aware, I've been teaching a series on Monday nights, a separate series called Bible 101, Learning or Relearning Your Way Around the Book. We've met twice already. We have 2 more sessions to go. If you're interested in that, you can sign up on Realm or just talk to me sometime this morning. We'll get you set up with that. And the last announcement, we've had some schedules in the back about what topics we're teaching on during the fall, and Margaret and I have had to make some slight adjustments on that. So just, truth in advertising here, what's coming up. Next week, I'll be teaching on health and the good life. Do as I say, not as I do, about that. And theology of kings, not the books of kings, but just the whole notion of kingship, which is a major development in the Older Testament. How does that fit the understanding of how one is supposed to live faithfully to God or not? What's the matter with kings according to various people in the Older Testament? Then November 9, Treasures on Earth. How does the Bible speak about good uses of our resources and our money? Again, do as I say, not as I do when it comes to that. Always hard to teach or to preach on money. But again, some big topics, right? These are things that matter, I think, in any culture, any time. But when we read the Bible, of course, we're looking at a very different political situation, a very different economic situation, a very different way of thinking about health and how human services work. And so how does the Bible guide us in our own particular contexts? Today, the theme is welcoming the stranger, and I want to begin with a prayer written by a Jewish woman, teacher and author, has a title, A Prayer for Undocumented Families Torn Apart, which seems timely to me. But as I walk through this prayer, as I read the prayer out loud, try to notice places where certain biblical sayings or themes appear. To me, it's a remarkable prayer for what it prays, an important prayer for what it prays, but remarkable in the ways in which you've got a Jewish prayer here using scriptural themes that are very much woven into kind of Jewish identity, but now in a new context, right? Praying for other kinds of families who are migrated and who are experiencing all kinds of disruption and separation. So we can not just read this prayer, we can pray it. Avinu Malkeinu, our parent, who shepherded us through the wilderness, sheltered us from evil, delivered us into a promised land, we cry out to you now for families in the wilderness. Children plucked from the arms of their loving parents, young people living behind bars, seeing a world lined with fences and walls, designed to keep them out, to keep them apart. We weep with parents who don't know where their children are and wonder if they are safe, if they have food to eat, if someone has outstretched an arm to them. We pray you give courage to these families, fill them with the understanding that we are behind them and with them, that we have been the wandering stranger, and we won't forget them or forsake them. We ask for your help In raising our voices, we pray for strength as we cry out and organize and fight. Oh God, we ask that you unharden hearts, that you fill leaders with compassion and loving kindness, that you help powerful people to remember we are all created in your image, and we all deserve dignity, that children have a birthright to love and safety. We pray that you will be with us as we return again and again to our leaders, asking them to let our people go. We don't ask for signs and wonders, but for the most basic thing, parents holding the children, children enveloped in a parent's loving embrace. Amen. I like the prayer. Again, maybe you notice themes in there, especially from the book of Exodus, woven into that now, again, like I said, for a new time and a new place and a new position, right, of power or influence or access to the people who make policies. So as we dive in today and go deeper into this question of welcoming the stranger, I want to start with a few caveats. And one is the whole notion of stranger, if we're going to use that word, that involves more than migrants and refugees, but I'm going to spend most of our time talking about that today, about the phenomenon of migrancy and those who are refugees. I believe this is true. I haven't really spent the time to dig in to try to figure out if I can confirm it, but apparently there are more displaced people living in the world today than there ever have been. And as far as we can tell in recorded history, in terms of people who, either by choice or even more alarmingly, have been forced either by necessity or politically to be uprooted and to be living in a kind of refugee status or kind of temporary status. I don't want to deny this is a complex topic, right, with very complex political and policy issues. If I had all the answers, probably wouldn't be spending my Sunday morning with all of you. I'd be out, on the trail or trying to get those policies implemented. So I just want to note that, right? We kind of have to simplify in only an hour together this morning. I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of you can speak to the experience of immigration better than I can. Some of you might be immigrants yourself or more closely connected to a generation that immigrated or that never had to immigrate. Perhaps you are from here. I also want to acknowledge that there is no such thing as, quote unquote, the immigrant experience, right? All of this depends upon who you are and what you look like, where you're from, what resources you have, and just want to acknowledge that. And acknowledge, too, that a lot of what we talk about when we talk about migration, particularly in this country, is very much connected to some of the things we've talked about the last 2 weeks as well. Right, questions of racialized history and politics in the United States in the course of our almost 250-year history, right? How certain groups have found it easier to immigrate to the United States than others, both socially and also legally. So just to acknowledge all of that. At the same time, this is an incredibly important period, I think, to talk about migrancy and refugees, the ways in which questions about what does it mean to be here, what does it mean to belong, who is welcome here, how that's been politicized, how that as well is starting to get picked up in religious discourse as well. Just a couple of things I've seen recently on my computer. Yes, that is the government's official site on what's now X.com, that single word, remigrate. You've got that church in Omaha, which apparently took the sign down relatively quickly once people complained to the archbishop. But again, the way in which we see this intersection between politics and certain kinds of biblical themes, certain ways in which the church is getting drawn into the debate, sometimes following certain politicized lines, right, and sometimes not so, right, but trying to keep it a distinctive voice. So this is an incredibly important topic to us, for our nation, for faith communities right now. So my goal today, again, is not to come up with clear answers, especially policy answers, but my goal today is really to draw us into the question of how the human experience of migration shapes our theology and how our theology shapes our view on human migration, right, whether forced or voluntary migration. So the question is, how can our understanding of biblical themes, right, that talk about migration and that talk about honoring the experience and the lives of immigrant peoples, how might that help us today not to view the political issue as a problem to solve, right, but as an aspect of human existence to which the gospel speaks, right, and to which the church is called to step in and to play a role. That's all by way of introduction. Now, a question, and this is wide open. We'll circulate the microphone right now, but it's this. What specific biblical stories, teachings, commands, or people come to your mind when you hear that theme, hospitality for strangers? Do any particular things pop into your head? Okay if they don't, but okay if they do. Mark's got a microphone, so it's easier for everybody to hear. Donna. Yeah.
Just when Jesus said, if you've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me.
Great. Yeah. So that's end of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, where people discover that in feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting prisoners, they've actually done so for Jesus.
Book of Ruth.
The book of Ruth, great example. If you don't know Ruth, small 4-chapter book in the Older Testament.
Good Samaritan.
Good Samaritan, great example. You've got an outsider who steps up and helps. That's in Luke chapter 10.
Jesus sending the disciples out and knocking on doors and staying where they're welcomed and moving on where they aren't.
Yeah, great example, right? He sends out his followers, tells them to basically don't bring extra clothing, don't do what you need to do to equip yourself, depend on the kindness of strangers or on the kindness of hosts. Yeah, Betty?
Love your neighbor as yourself, and understanding that neighbor has a very broad context.
Yeah, love your neighbor as yourself. Quoting out of Leviticus there, Jesus re-ups that or cites that passage. What's also interesting is if you keep reading on in that same chapter, Leviticus 19, I believe it is, later on in that same chapter, it says actually love the alien as yourself as well, right? Or love the stranger as yourself. We'll talk about that in a minute. Nobody ever quotes that part, but it's connected, right? Like you said, the idea of neighbor is broadly construed. Thank you.
In Hebrews, when they talk about doing things because maybe you have entertained angels unaware.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the book of Hebrews has this thing about being kind, welcoming to strangers, because some people have done that without realizing they're entertaining angels. Doris.
When Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt because lives were threatened.
Yes, thank you. I put the photo up there, the image, hoping somebody would get that. You did it. Doris, you got it. You didn't even need the image, right? Exactly. So in Matthew's gospel, the Holy Family has to flee to Egypt, which is ironic given the history of Egypt and Jesus' ancestors way back in Genesis. Any other thoughts come to mind? The way in the back, Dwayne's got one. You've named everything that I put on my own list, so that's great.
Would it be the story of Melchizedek, the welcoming of Abraham as a stranger, right?
Yeah, so here's a really peculiar story in Genesis. There's a guy named Melchizedek who just kind of comes out of the shadows almost to greet Abraham, to bless Abraham. And he's this foreign king, right, from a different place. Makes you think of the Magi in Matthew's gospel as well. These visitors, all we're told is they're from the east. One more, yeah.
And Jesus and the woman at the well.
Yeah, great one. Jesus and the woman at the well. He's in Samaria, and it's the middle of the day, and the Samaritan woman comes to draw water, and she's quite aware how odd this is. You're not supposed to really be here, and there's this lovely exchange between the two of them. So we've got a variety of stories here. Thank you for all of those. We might ask the question, too, of like what counts as a stranger? That's kind of an odd word to use. I'm using it because, as we'll see in a bit, it's a term that shows up in a lot of our Bible translations. But what counts as a stranger versus a neighbor? That's why Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, because somebody wants to parse the difference there, and Jesus seems uninterested in having a difference, right? Seems to want to blow those divisions open. It raises the question, then, the Bible has so much to say about strangers or outsiders or migrants or however we want to, whatever kind of language we want to use there, which raises the question, why is migration, again, whether forced or voluntary, remember not all migrants are doing so by choice, Why is migration such a common biblical theme? Right? Why does it show up so much in the Bible? I think there's three answers to that, right? And one of those is it's simply part of Israel's own history and self-identity, right? As far back as we can look into things like Genesis and the book of Exodus, and when Joseph's descendants are living in Egypt, are enslaved in Egypt, they are migrating. We look farther back, we see Abraham, he's migrating. There's a way in which this is really inscribed on the culture of the Hebrew people, later the Jewish people that we see in Scripture, that Scripture follows around. So it's a historical reality. It's part of a people's own existence. A second reason, I think, is that I believe that migration is also part of the character of God. And I'm going to unpack that in just a minute, right? There's a way in which even God experiences migrancy. God knows what it's like to be a migrant. And in that regard, this migrancy is also a theological reality, something inscribed unto God's own character. And here the work of a theologian named Peter Fahn is really helpful to me, who's a professor at Georgetown. He might be retired now, but I don't remember. Nevertheless, has this lovely article about called God the Migrant. And he says a couple of things. This gets kind of academic theologian. I'm going to apologize for that. But briefly here, he says God's creative act, right? When we look at the way the Bible talks about God as a creator, as somebody deeply involved with the creation, not as this distant power, but as a presence. God's creative act can be interpreted as God's migration out of what is divine into what is not, a movement that bears all the marks of human migration. In creating that which is other than God's own self, God crosses the border between absolute spirit and finite matter. Here we go, right? Here's theology or philosophy majors, get excited. Migrating from eternity to temporality, from omnipotence into weakness, from self-sufficiency to utter dependence, from secure omniscience, from all-knowing to fearful ignorance, from the total domination of the divine will over all things to the utter subjection of the same will to the unpredictable conditions of human freedom. Greek philosophy majors, you're really excited now too, by the way, Aristotelians. From life to death. In other words, God in creation, right, refuses to be this kind of distant, self-satisfied, self-contained God, but takes on the experiences of a wider variety of existing. In the creative act, God experiences for the first time the precarious, marginalized, threatened, and endangered condition of the migrant. In other words, migrant experience is also in some ways similar to God's own experience because of God's refusal to stay put in a kind of godlike perfection, in some ivory heaven somewhere. Fahn also goes on to talk about Jesus as well as a way of viewing God as migratory. He says the incarnation, right, the idea of God taking on flesh in Jesus Christ, is to be understood not as simply God's emergency plan after humanity's fallen to sin, but rather as the culmination of God's first migration into creation. In other words, Jesus is not this emergency rescue plan, right? Jesus is, in a sense, the end or the goal of God's creation, right? Of God's desire to not just to create something, but to be enmeshed within that creation. In this migration into history, as a Jew in the land of Palestine, God, like a human migrant, entered a far country where God, as part of a colonized nation, encounters people of different racial, ethnic, and national backgrounds with strange languages, unfamiliar customs, and foreign cultures, among whom God, again like a migrant, after a life-threatening journey, pitched the tent or tabernacled. Quotes there from John chapter 1, right? God became flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us in John chapter 1. The word there is literally God pitched a tent or lived in a tent among us as a sojourner. So Fahn's trying to make this case that we see this even throughout the Bible, in the Older Testament in terms of creation, in the Newer Testament certainly in Jesus Christ as God become flesh. There's some other places Fahn might have talked about as well. Some of these are things that we've talked about in recent months or years here. In Exodus chapter 13, this is after the crossing of the Red Sea. The people are pretty much on their own. They're just starting their wanderings, and we're told the Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them among the way, and in the pillar of fire by night to give them light, so that they might travel by day and by night. Lovely Alexander just walked in. I believe she preached on this summer. I think that was the cover art, if I remember correctly. Is this right? This is unplanned. There you go. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. In other words, God leads the people, but God is also present, right? God doesn't just leave a map to the folks after their escape from Egypt. God sojourns among them. In Exodus 33, further along now, Moses is hanging out with God. This is a lot of Exodus. Moses is on the mountain speaking with God. And Moses now is contending with God, as Moses often does. And he says to the Lord, "See, you have said to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Consider, too, that this nation is your people." In other words, you've told me to lead them. I don't really know where I'm going. I don't really have a map. And it'd be really nice if you gave us some more guidance. God said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." In other words, God promises again to travel among them. And Moses said to God, "If your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here." In other words, let's not even leave the mountain. Like we're not packing the tents if you're not coming with us, basically. "For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us?" In other words, what are the neighbors going to say, right? No one's going to believe that you're a mighty God if you just leave us out there on our own in the wilderness. "In this way we shall be distinct," right? If you travel with us, we will be distinct from the other nations. We will have a God who's not just portable and movable, right, but who is committed to being with us. "I will be distinct from your people, from every people on the face of the earth. The Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." So this commitment that God makes to be a traveler. And then jumping way ahead, we talked about Ezekiel. I think Margaret drew this card 2 years ago. She's remembering it now. Ezekiel's a tough book, right? It's got some very disturbing imagery. But here's one of the interesting images in Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a priest, and he's in the exile, or at least he's writing or he's communicating to people who have been exiled into Babylon, into modern-day Iraq, right? This is after the worst disaster imaginable for the nation of Judah. The temple's been destroyed, they've been overrun, and Ezekiel has a vision of God for the people in exile. This is very early on in the book. And what he sees is something like a chariot. It's a very weird description of what he sees. But he says, "I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures." These appear to be angelic-like beings or some kind of manifestations of the divine. "One for each of the four of them, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel." Already I'm lost, right? "When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them. And when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, and the wheels rose among them, for a living spirit was in the wheels." Nobody quite knows how to describe this. Here's William Blake's shot, which is not bad. You can kind of see wheels in there. You see a variety of faces looking different directions. You see eyes in there. It appears to be this image of like a chariot that has these wheels. We would call them like casters today, or something that can roll in a variety of directions. Any engineers in the room? Stop rolling your eyes. Something that can easily move. In other words, what we see here is a chariot. We see this idea of the throne of God not being something fixed, but something that's movable. And one big part of Ezekiel's message to the folks in exile is God is here in exile with you. You didn't lose connection to God when you were driven out of Jerusalem. God remains among you. So we see these various places where there's this discovery of God as well, living like a refugee or being accessible to refugees and to migrants. So that's what I mean when I say that migration is part of God's character. The third reason I think that migration shows up so often in the Bible is migration is simply what people do and have always done to survive and flourish. For most of the history of humanity, right, people have had to migrate. Sometimes that's just their nature. They haven't lived with necessarily a fixed connection to a particular place on earth. Sometimes it's because of weather or natural disasters. Sometimes it's just simply to adapt with the seasons, right? Animals migrate depending upon whether human beings have done that for quite a long time. There are times when human beings have had to migrate because at the tip of a spear because they've been forced to. But in general, migration is part of kind of a human reality, which I forget because I get all my food in the exact same place all of the time at the grocery store, right? And I own land, or the bank owns land for me. And right, this is relatively new in the history of humanity that you would own land like that and be able to have the luxury, right, of not having to pack up and move on a regular basis. So that's also one of the reasons why it's so much there in Scripture. So where are some of the places we see it? We've named some of these. Abraham and Sarah, I talked about last week. Joseph and his brothers, I've talked a little bit about. This is Joseph's not the most likable person, and so his brothers sell him into slavery because they're just sick of him. That's their solution instead of murdering him. So, on the scale of things you can do to your siblings, you can put that wherever you want. But there's an interesting thing that happens in Joseph's story. Joseph ends up in Egypt, and he's able to help administer the way through a devastating famine in Egypt, and his brothers show up. And Joseph recognizes them and eventually reveals himself to them. And they're contrite, of course. They're fleeing from a famine. And Joseph lets them stay alive. But there's something that happens in that story that's really fascinating. And I was helped with this by a book by Isaac Samuel Villegas, who is a Mennonite pastor in North Carolina, who's got this lovely book called Migrant God, A Christian Vision for Immigrant Justice, which I recommend. But he points out how even in that story of Joseph welcoming his brothers into Egypt, there's an interesting kind of bit of evidence about the ways in which migrant communities help each other out amidst the threat of living in a new place. So in Genesis 46, Joseph is instructing his brothers what to say because they're new, right? They've just arrived in Egypt. They've come from somewhere else. They're trying to survive. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh. Joseph's kind of Pharaoh's in his cabinet, right? He's risen quite high in the system. I'll go to Pharaoh and I'll say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have here. Now he gives the instruction. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our ancestors. In other words, don't say you know how to do anything else besides shepherding. Why? Because then he's going to assign you to live in Goshen. Because Goshen is not where the Egyptians want to live. It's where they stick all of the outsiders. In other words, you want to get assigned to the ghetto. You want to get assigned to the immigrant ghetto because this is going to be better for you there. So this is how you do it. So just interesting, right? There's this kind of way in which somebody has to help a migrant group navigate a system, right? This is what you say to the people in power so that you'll end up in the right place. Not to endorse that or say that that's right? But we see the risk in which they exist. Joseph's brothers exist as these newcomers. Anyway, that's Joseph. The Exodus, of course, the wilderness wanderings, we've talked a bit about that recently. There's a big migratory experience. There are Levitical laws in the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy about sojourners or aliens or strangers. Those are all in quotes. Those are different ways in which English translations have rendered a Hebrew word called gerim. The singular of that is ger. And nobody's quite sure how best to translate it. The term alien and stranger don't always quite work. Sojourner doesn't necessarily have a sense of risk connected to it. But let me look at a couple of these laws. We talked about Leviticus 19 earlier. Here's some more from Leviticus. When you reap the harvest of your land, these are laws now to the Israelites, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. In other words, don't harvest absolutely everything, right? Things that fall along the way, don't pick it all up. You shall not strip the vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. Literally, the poor and the gerim is the Hebrew word here. I am the Lord your God. In other words, save something, right? Save stuff so that people can come along and feed themselves off of your land. Later on, when an alien, again, this is gerim in Hebrew, resides with you in the land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the native born among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. I mentioned this earlier. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So here you have the justification, right? Why should we do this? Why should we be so kind to the gerim, The answer is, you know what it's like. You lived that experience when you were in Egypt. Deuteronomy, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, who loves the strangers. Again, it's gerim. Why is it translated differently? Great question. Who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger. You shall love the ger, for you were gerim. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. So this is deeply rooted in Israel's own experience. The big question is, who in the world are these gerim? Who are these aliens? Who are these strangers? This is important because I'm hearing a lot of talk about this in some politics these days when people are talking about the Older Testament, when certain politicians are. I've heard people say things like, well, the gerim, these are like people with green cards. These are aliens who got into the country legally. The problem with that is there are no borders in the ancient world. There are no border patrols. There are no passports. There is no kind of legal proof of citizenship in the ancient world. In other words, there is no real difference between legal migration and illegal migration. The only real illegal migration is if you're leading an army somewhere, right? That's a different kind of thing. These are countries where people are mobile, are traveling. Some of them are nomadic and remain nomadic, right? And come in and out of various places under the aegis of different kings and rulers. And so that it's really not right to call the gerim aliens, right? As if there's a kind of legal distinction that means you're not supposed to be here or you're only here on loan. See the difference there? It's also not right to imagine that this group, the gerim, as best we can tell from how that term is used, is always about so-called outsiders. Like, what about ethnic divisions, right? Some of the divisions in the ancient world are based on ethnicity, but really not that neat and clean as you might be led to believe sometimes, right? Also, this is what people do. They fall in love, they intermarry, they move. It's been happening since time immemorial. The gerim are not necessarily like people who look different or people who speak different languages, although they might. The gerim tend to, the best sense we have of this is the gerim are folks who don't enjoy the usual safety net that's afforded through living within a clan. In other words, the gerim might be strangers from somewhere else who have moved there among you for whatever reason. The gerim might be people who have lost all of their family, right, and no longer have anybody to help them when they're sick, when they're injured, when they grow old, something like that. The gerim might have been people who, for whatever reason, have lost everything financially and are destitute. You see what I mean? There's a sense in which, in our current context, yes, they would be migrants. Yes, they would also perhaps be poor people, right, or powerless people, or people who have lost a lot. Does that make sense? And so don't listen when somebody tells you the gerim are a certain kind of legal category in the ancient world. These are anybody who needs a help up, anybody who's lost the ways in which society is designed to function by the ways in which families and clans take care of one another. Does that help? All right. Ask a Bible scholar, get a long answer. The conquest, talked about this last week. I'll refer you back to that. That involves travel, movement in and conflict, of course. Ruth and Naomi, this was mentioned earlier, four chapter lovely story about women who have to cross lands, have to go into other nations, have to survive through their own hard work, through their own cunning, and through the kindness of others. It's this beautiful story about the ways in which people take care of one another and display a loving kindness that God also displays. We have an exile and multiple waves of exiles and returns from exile in the Older Testament. That takes up a lot of ink. We mentioned the Holy Family in Matthew's Gospel. There are also New Testament themes about dispersion or diaspora, and I want to just quickly highlight a couple of those places in the Newer Testament where we see references to kind of an impermanent existence or to travel. The book of Hebrews is a good place to start. Here the author has just run through, a list of Older Testament figures who have shown faith. And the author says all of these people died in faith without having received the promises. But from a distance, they saw and greeted them. In other words, they never saw the fulfillment of what God had promised, the consummation of all things, a chicken in every pot. They never saw that. but nevertheless they remained faithful. The author goes on, they confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. In other words, they didn't quite fit in, right? They didn't quite imagine this world as it is currently constructed as the be-all and end-all. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better homeland, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, God has prepared a city for them. The imagination here appears to be these folks didn't look back, right? They lived a life of faith that was very much about a one-directional journey, right? It was not a round trip, right? It was, where will God lead us next? There was a kind of impermanence about them. And in a way, the book of Hebrews is trying to spiritualize that, saying in a way, this is what the walk of faith looks like, right? It looks like that movement into what's new. The Acts of the Apostles, another book that I think is really helpful in terms of thinking about the church, is the church's own mobility and the way in which the church doesn't exactly fit into the structures of this world. I'm really helped here by Willie James Jennings, who's a professor at Yale Divinity School, who talks a lot about this notion of diaspora. And if that's a new word to you, to see the word dispersed in it, right? Dispersed peoples. What does it mean to live part of a dispersed identity? We talk about a Jewish diaspora in both the ancient world, now in the modern world. Jennings, in his own writings, talks a lot about the African-American diaspora. What does it mean to be African, but to now live in a different place and to not enjoy the same kinds of rights or acceptance that perhaps others do? And he takes that perspective of his own sense of diaspora and applies it to the book of Acts, which is the story of Jesus' first followers, or at least some of Jesus' first followers, and how the church starts to take root. I quote this a lot. If you've seen me quote it before, it's because I love these paragraphs where he's talking about the diaspora experience and talking about how the Newer Testament seems to be aware of how precarious that experience is. So Jennings says this: danger and threat surround diaspora life. Diaspora life is life crowded with self-questioning and questions for God, considering the anger, hatred, and violence visited upon a people. We must never confuse voluntary migration with diaspora, because diaspora is a geographic and social world not chosen, and a psychic state, right, a mental state inescapable. The peoples who inhabit diaspora live with animus and violence filling the air they breathe. Let me pause there. In some ways, this is maybe generalization, right? But he's trying to get into the idea of a migrant experience, whether that's, again, a forced migration or a voluntary one. He's going on here. Diaspora people live always on the verge of being classified enemy, always in evaluation of their productivity to the empire, always having an acceptance on loan, ready to be taken away at the first sign of sedition. They live with fear as an ever-present partner in their lives, the fear of being turned into a them, a dangerous other, those people among us. They also remember loss of land and place, of life and hope, and even for some, loss of faith. Yet diaspora is also power, the power of a conviction to survive and the power of a confession to never yield to the forces that would destroy them. Diaspora is life by any means necessary. What Jennings says about the book of Acts, about the Acts of the Apostles, is he says you've got these dispersed people. In some cases, these are Jews living in various places of the Roman Empire. It's also people who don't quite fit into the imperial system, who find themselves as strangers or people living, on loan, to use Jennings's language, in the Roman Empire. You've also got the empire itself, right, which makes these promises, right? Submit to the ways of the empire, play by our rules, your life will be secure. And Jennings's point is that Acts offers a third way, right? Between this way of kind of dislocation and of powerlessness, and the idea of an empire that asks you to assimilate, that the church offers this way where everybody can belong, everybody can find community, and nobody's asked to give up their identity. Nobody's asked to give up exactly who they are. You might be thinking, well, it sounds like he's romanticizing the church a little bit, and you're exactly right, but welcome to the Bible. At times that's what happens, right? We're working with ideals and we're working with aspirations. But Jennings is saying, right, how is the church, as the book of Acts imagines it, supposed to be a place where people find belonging, where people find acceptance, not because they assimilate, simply because of who they are. A couple other New Testament writings talk about this in similar ways. The books of James and 1 Peter are both books that are addressed to diaspora people or to refugees. It uses that language to describe the church. If you were around last year, you might remember videos. We had scholar videos a year ago, and we have two great ones, one with Margaret Amer there on the left, Shively Smith on the right. Margaret talks about the book of James. She's preached at Westminster a couple of times, if you've been here 5 to 10 years. Shively Smith, we ought to get her to preach here sometimes. But both of them gave some great interviews, I think. Margaret's nodding. What else is she going to say? About these books, but also about how to read these, how to take seriously what they say about the church as being like a migrant people or having a kind of migrant identity, but not really being that, right? Like some churches are. We can go to immigrant churches around the Twin Cities if we want to and live that experience. But what does that mean? So when James addresses itself to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, what does that mean for how a church understands itself? Does it mean for how a church understands itself as being, in some ways, full of strangers, right, or not quite fitting in to its host culture? James goes on later on, talks about the importance of caring for orphans and widows in their distress, keeping oneself unstained by the world. The world that James imagines is a hostile place. 1 Peter addresses itself to the exiles of the dispersion and then names a bunch of regions in what's modern Turkey. And again, using that kind of language for the church, right, as being, not revolutionary people, not being necessarily actively persecuted by the state, but again, not quite fitting in. So this language is throughout Scripture, right? This language of what does it mean to belong? What does it mean to not belong? How do you help those who are at risk in terms of their own belonging? Which leads me to this slide, right? 3 things I think about. I told you no answers today, maybe some, but here are some things I think about, like how does this language, how do these values, these norms influence us? One thing I think about is how do we let laws from the Older Testament shape and affirm our basic values without suggesting they should provide a model for current modern policies? There's some laws in Leviticus I really like. I've cited some of them for you. There's some laws in Leviticus I really don't like. I haven't cited some of those for you. Leviticus imagines a nation ruled by God. Imagines a literal theocracy in which Israel's priests have a tremendous amount of power. That's not the world I'm looking for. All respect to Margaret and other clergy in the room. I don't want to be ruled by clergy. So how do we take the good and leave the bad? You'd be great though. Of all the clergy I know a lot of clergy. You'd be great. Yeah. We're gonna have a supervisory meeting today. All right. Margaret's my supervisor. Right? How do we avoid falling into that trap, right, of looking at biblical verses and saying, this is how America should be governed, right? Well, how do we find nuance between the two? What happens when we imagine the Christian life and the work of a church as more like a journey and less like a landed or settled existence? See the difference there? How do we avoid falling into the way of saying, well, we've got where we're supposed to be, and now we're going to set down roots and never leave this spot? I don't mean this in terms of real estate and geography, although sometimes that's the case. But what does that mean for our sense of who we are and how we exist in the world? Right? How much do we rest on the past of how we got here? How much do we look forward toward what's next? What is God calling us to next? Third thing I think about, how do immigrants, based on their experiences, teach the wider church about who God is and what God's faithfulness is like? If the Bible's serious about God showing up in migratory experiences or in the experiences of migrating people and of refugees, what does that mean for me, right? How do I have something to learn, right, from people who have experienced God in very different kinds of ways? This is what I think about in my spare time, these 3 questions. But these are ways we might be challenged by some of these passages. All right. Time for some discussion questions. This is a lot of information, right? I'm just kind of throwing a lot of biblical texts out there and trying to sort it into some categories, both like where they come from in the Bible, but also why certain passages are important and how they speak about God. So one of my questions is this: how does your theology shape your sense of why it's good to be welcoming? In other words, how does a desire to be welcoming resonate with your understanding of who God is? In other words, how does the church commit itself to be welcoming beyond reasons of, well, it's a nice thing to do, right? How does it somehow communicate who we think God is? Second question is, what exactly can meaningful welcome look like, or welcoming others look for us, Westminster, you, your family, however you want to define us there, given the contours of our society, culture, and economy? Right? A lot of what we read about in like Israelite culture, I talked about the clan structure, I talked about the ways in which families would care. A lot of that we have outsourced in our world, right? I have a retirement account, I have health insurance. I try to live in ways that I won't be burdens to my children. They appreciate that. Right? That's just kind of the values with which I was raised. Those are very different from the kind of values, the kind of social world the Bible imagines. What does that mean then for how we think about welcome, right? How people's security is guaranteed in this world, financially, legally, socially. What does that look like for us? How might the Bible spur us to imagine ways that are fitting for the economy, for the society, for the politics in which we live? Two easy questions. I'm sure you'll get these knocked out of the park. These are meant to generate some thinking. And I'm going to leave you to them, and then I'll come back in about 10 minutes, and we'll share all the answers. Sound good? Just gather at your table. There's nice people there. Be welcoming to each other with these questions. You might view things in very different ways. And folks online, please use the chat. Reach out to one another. We have a few minutes left, so why don't we come back together and get some feedback from the tables. Mark's got the microphone. I'm curious if there's a place in your conversation that was particularly engaging, or some energy in terms of a particular idea or disagreement or a tangent. Anybody want to let the larger group in on some energizing conversation at your table? Mark, right, your own table.
Sure.
I'm going to share something Mark said because he's probably doesn't do that. But he was talking about, we've had the privilege of being at Jessica's, oh, okay. This is something Mark said. And he and I have had the privilege of hearing Jessica's sermon, which fits beautifully with this, but that Jessica talks about when she talks about welcoming, and she talks about sort of the vision of how it should be. She says creatures, which broadens it to include all environmental factors and everything, which I thought was an interesting point.
Yeah, thank you.
Several of the people at this table were at marches yesterday in different places around the state. And one of the themes of the marches was to embrace the immigrant, to love the migrant, to love, and it was, in our area, it was all the way through. I was with about 100,000 of my best friends downtown yesterday, and it was extraordinary. The feeling, we talked about joy and how uplifting it was to be there and show what we're for. Not just what we're against, but what we're for. And I think that's really key. And there were no police presence that we were aware of anywhere in the different marches. I'm sure they were present, but they were completely, I didn't see one police in the whole march. But there was only one bad sign, and it was a sign a man brought with 4 Israeli flags up a long thing with swastikas right in the middle of each flag. And so there are those who are unwelcoming, and there are those who are saying, no, it's about all of us. It's everybody.
Thank you.
The one thing I've been thinking about in the last couple years is whatever happened to the golden rule, you know? And I think about that, and I've been bringing that up with people, because if we just go to that,
the way my theology shaped my welcoming is that in the Quran, God addressed mankind as the children of Adam. So, according to the theology of the Quran, nobody is immigrant.
Yeah. Right. We're at 10:15. I'm sure we could talk about these topics a lot. I hope we could keep talking about these topics. It's good to know the sermon connects with this. I had no idea. Hopefully we'll see you in worship. Next week, I'll be teaching, like I said, health and the good life. We'll see you next week. I won't be selling supplements or anything like that, I promise. Yeah.